Hey, it's day 10 of Arthurian April, and this lady doesn't feel like getting out of bed, so that's where we're going to record tonight. Today, we're talking about Merlin. Now, most people know Merlin the Magician. He's definitely become probably the most household name of any of the characters in King Arthur that isn't King Arthur because he's just so cool. If you're probably imagining a white bearded guy with a blue hat who has an owl, that's probably because you watched The Sword and the Stone from Disney, which is my first exposure to Merlin as well, as somewhat of a, slightly befuddled old man who occasionally makes some seriously bad choices and lives backwards in time. That part is important too. If you've been following along for the last couple of days, you'll not be surprised to hear that Merlin actually is from an earlier tradition that was absorbed into the Arthurian canon. Of course, he came from the Welsh, and the character of Merlin, or Merdin, depending on how you want to mispronounce your Welsh. Some of the things that we know about him come from that earlier time, but it really isn't until our good friend Geoffrey of Monmouth that a lot of the very typical features of Merlin start to coalesce. Most importantly, his own birth is rather interesting. In many of the stories, most of the stories, he is actually a Cambion, which is a half demon, because his father is a devil, a demon of some sort, and his mother sometimes is a virgin. And in fact, in some of the stories, Merlin is actually the Antichrist, and sometimes it takes him convincing so that he doesn't do the things that Antichrists do. Generally, Merlin is like a generation older than Arthur, but not in every retelling. That's primarily the kind of thing that we see, sort of like a mentor relationship between Arthur and Merlin. Of course, most famously, T.H. White's Once and Future King. There's this whole sort of childhood with Merlin where he learns to be different animals, he learns to experience the world, and kind of becomes tutored by Merlin so that he can become a better king. Merlin is always very tied up in making sure that Arthur becomes king, but sometimes the whole problem being that he's also seeing the prophecies of Mordred potentially being the end of Arthur, to speak of. So despite all the work that he does, he's not usually able to see through to the end of the story. So in most of the tales, by the time Arthur is crowned and has been king for a while, Merlin is no longer there. Most famously, as we talked about in our Lady of the Lake episode, that he is captured by either Nimue or Vivian and literally doesn't get to see the fruits of his labor. Now, typically, Merlin's a nice guy. I took a different tact in my stories. Not that he's entirely evil, but in the Queens of Fate series, Merlin is not a hero. Merlin is a politician. Merlin is a machinator. Like, his whole purpose is to make sure that Arthur gets the crown no matter what. And he really doesn't care who he has to step over or who he has to minimize to get that done. But he's also just a sad old man by the time of the book, as we learn. And even though my main character, Anna Pendragon, who we'll talk about later, seeks to seek vengeance upon him, and he's a much bigger figure than she is, he's got a lot of blind spots, especially when it comes to women. But he's just a mortal guy. He's just a guy that learned a lot of magic and had a lot of power and influence. And that's the kind of stories that I like to tell. As much as I love talking about magic and spells and sort of the superhero qualities that some of the knights have, for me, what's most compelling is finding out who these people really are aside from everything else. Now, this is one of my absolutely favorite illustrations, medieval illuminations of the conception of Merlin, because the look on this woman's face is like so done with everything. But yeah, that is Merlin's mom and dad, if you're interested. Some other fun facts: there are plenty of romances specifically about Merlin. Some of my favorite include the Vita Merlini, which is like this weird apocalyptic back and forth conversation between Merlin and his twin sister, Ganita. And it goes back and forth about the end of the world with all kinds of weird portents. And I definitely stole from that because I thought it was so cool. And I used some of that in the third book in my series. I also think it's awesome that he had a sister. We never hear about that. And yeah, I again definitely stole from that a little bit. In addition, one of my favorite series of all time, which is the Mary Stuart series starting with the Crystal Cave, highly recommended, is a wonderful telling of the life of Merlin. And if you really want to get a gorgeous overview of the characterization and everything leading up to who Merlin was, along with the awesome dragons in the bottom of the castle earthquake stuff and his ability to calm them down and all the things that lead him into being the Merlin the magician that we know, that's the one that I would start with.